For half a century, WJPZ Syracuse has been the greatest media classroom on the planet.
We've trained students from the 1970s to the 2020s on how to run a professional radio station.
But the lessons learned and relationships formed go far beyond studios and transmitters.
Taking a look back through the eyes of those who experienced it.
This is WJPZ at 50.
Welcome to WJPZ at 50. I am not John Jag Gay. I'm Matt DelSignore, class of 2002, and I'm taking over this episode of the podcast to give some well-deserved flowers to the creator of this tremendous undertaking. JAG has devoted countless hours to curating the rich history of the greatest media classroom by talking to the people who were there for it all, the highs, the lows, AM, FM, the founders, and the future of the station and its proud alumni association. So now we need to hear about your journey, your beginnings at Z89, your radio tours in Burlington, Vermont, Detroit, New Orleans, Detroit again, and starting your own business in podcasting. So welcome, Jag, to your own show.
Thank you, Matt. That is quite the introduction. I got to tell you, I'm actually pretty nervous today. It's much easier for me to be on the other side of the glass, so to speak. But I'm excited to get started. You kind of teed off everything we're going to talk about today. Where do you want to start?
Well, before we get into all that, I want to start this episode actually talking about the WJPZ at 50 podcast itself. Mm-hmm. What was the spark for this, and what were you hoping to accomplish?
Interestingly enough, it was my cousin. My cousin Jason, Hofstra University class of 1998. Hofstra University is doing a podcast series called the Hofstra Radio Yearbook, where they're interviewing various alumni from the WRHU at Hofstra University. He sent me the link and he said, hey, you might want to think about doing something like this for your radio station at Syracuse. And I said, well, it's actually the 50th anniversary. This couldn't be better timing. And I took a listen to the show, and the show was well done. And I thought, wow, there's so much potential here to tell stories of great alumni that have gone on to huge heights in our industry, from Scott McFarland to Howie Deneroff. And then, like you said, founders like Greg Hernandez and Bill Bliley, down to Kyle Leff, who graduated in 2022 and helped the station through COVID. There's so much to tell. And I also wanted to make sure that I told it from a lot of different viewpoints, because I think all the alumni listening, you know, are geared toward their own class and think about their own classmates and like those episodes. And it'd be very easy for me to talk to you and Brett Bossy and Peterman and Leah and Beth and Jada and our class about our time, but I wanted to make sure I covered all decades. And I'm happy to say that we've got alumni from 6 different decades in the podcast. And it's really been a learning experience for me, too, to learn some of these stories, then also get to know some alumni that I see every year in Syracuse, but then some that I don't know that well.
What are some of the standout stories you've heard so far? Some history you didn't know, or some perspective you hadn't considered, or some memories that were shared by others that, you know, made an impression on you?
You know, I hate to say it, it was almost like a Tooth Fairy Santa Claus moment with Bill Bliley when he talked about his recollection of the call letters being different than the story we hear from Rick every year. His recollection of the FCC's arrival in the 70s, different than Rick's. I'm not going to spoil it. Go back and listen to the episode with he and Carol Mason. Consider that a teaser. A lot of the stuff that was just before our era with Dina Jacoby and Harry Waring, Dina Lofheimer and Harry Waring, the receivership era in the late 90s and how close we came to losing this precious thing we call JPZ. Obviously, the move and the excitement to FM in the 80s, you know, we know about the flamethrower days in the early 90s, but even since 2000, the last 20 years or so, folks like Corey Crockett and Liz Doyen talking about moving the station into their new studios about 10 years ago. That was 2012. Hearing some of the love stories from JPZ, Alex Brewer and Molly Nelson and their story of getting together. We've got an episode with James Bames Grundy, who helped me edit the podcast, and Melody M. They're engaged, how they got together. Rob and Sue Weingarten from the 1980s who got together. So it's funny, there was I think on Jay Leno's last Tonight Show, he ended it by bringing this whole group out on stage, and these are all the relationships that started here on the Tonight Show and the families that have started because of the show, and that's my legacy. I feel like in some small part, that's JPZ's legacy of all these people that have gotten together, not just the friendships, but marriages and kids and so on.
It's so much bigger than what happens in the studio and what goes out from the transmitter, to be sure. Let's now turn to the Book of Jag, Chapter 1.
How long you got?
Well, it all depends on you. You're editing this episode.
No pressure.
What brought you to Syracuse, and how did you eventually find your way to the radio station?
My Aunt Carol had a college consulting business where she would work with high schoolers and help them figure out what schools to apply to, help them with the applications and all that. So I obviously went to her, and I knew I wanted to get into communications. Like almost half the guests on our podcast, I wanted to get into sports. I thought in high school I was going to be the next play-by-play voice of the New England Patriots. I wanted to be a sports guy. If you want to get into sports and broadcasting, obviously Syracuse is the one. You know, it was down in the end to me between Syracuse and Boston University after the financial aid packages came in. And I really hadn't been away from home very much. And I was pretty nervous to go 5 hours from home in Boston. So I thought to myself, well, worst case scenario here, would I rather be at Syracuse and come home or be sitting there at Boston University thinking, I wonder what if I'd gone to Syracuse. So every picture from opening weekend, my eyes are red. I was a mess. I was crying. I was a mess. I was scared. I was homesick. It was the anxiety now that as an adult I realize that I have. And I was terrified. And I later found out as they pulled away and dropped me off at Sadler Hall, my dad said to my mom, we'll be back to get him in 6 weeks. And my mom goes, no, give him some time. I think he's going to be okay. And luckily, Mom was right. So I really was kind of homesick. I hadn't really found, I hate to use the phrase, found my tribe, but I feel like everybody in the show has used it so far. I really didn't know what I was doing aside from going to class and some friends I'd made in the dorm. Two people play in here. So my really good friend Jill Person from high school, her older brother Brian Person was JPZ class of 1998. He had just left. I think it was 98. And so through my friend Jill, his younger sister, I'd heard about the radio station. And then I also had a lab for a physics class that I was in. And there was this cute girl sitting by herself. And one of the few times in my life I had the guts to go up to the cute girl and talk to her, I did. And that girl was Andy DeCastro. And we struck up a friendship. She said I should come check out the radio station. And I did. And it was everything that everybody on this podcast has said. It was warm, it was welcoming, led by Harry as the GM. And then the folks that had gotten there a couple months before me, I got there probably October, November-ish, and by then you and Jana and Beth and Dave Easton and Greg Dixon and all these guys from our class were there, and Jamie Scavato was there, and I don't want to leave anybody out, but so many folks, Marty and Peterman, later Bossy, all these folks that really felt like they were at home. Meanwhile, I was, like many of guests again on the podcast, I was also working at WAER. I was lucky enough to get cleared to get in my first semester, rather. And the process at AER is you go in once a week at 4 a.m. and you write a sportscast that doesn't go on the air. You dictate it into a tape recorder and you get ripped apart. And then if you're good enough, the second semester your freshman year, you get to do the same thing in the afternoon and get ripped apart. And all these steps to hopefully become play-by-play guy for Syracuse football, basketball, and lacrosse. Well, in these two paths that were going at the same time, before I was cleared to be on the air at AER, I'd become senior and chief announcer at JPZ. Harry had wanted to empower me to have a more active role at the radio station. I'm like, well, I'm not on the air yet here, and I'm helping out run the staff of however many DJs we had at the time. This is kind of a no-brainer. Plus, AER, God bless it, they've got so many famous alums come out of there, but it was so cutthroat and so competitive, I didn't memorize the statistics of West Coast basketball players that were games were on at midnight. I couldn't keep up. I couldn't compete with it. And for as much as I love sports, sports wasn't fun. This was fun. Now, I wasn't a huge music guy growing up like you were, Matt, but this was fun. The music part of it was fun, but it was the people. And I know that's been said so many times in the podcast. Again, you and Beth and Jana and Brett and so many that I'm still close friends with to this day. It was fun. I wasn't homesick anymore at that point. I loved being there and, it had to drag me out of there kicking and screaming 4 years later.
I remember that. You mentioned being able to rise through the ranks of the staff pretty quickly. You want to give us a run through of the positions you held on staff?
I really had a passion for the on-air piece of it. So then I became senior announcer under Steve Cellini, DJ Steele, and then chief announcer. This is as you were becoming program director and GM, if my memory serves. And I got to help run the air staff and do air checks, which is something that I loved doing. I loved working with new talent, and this was true in my radio career too. But I love working with folks and saying, hey, you did a great job of that, work on this for next time. And then, this was good too. And then the next air check, they did what you suggested. They sounded better and they took pride in that. That was a drug for me. I loved doing that. So I was chief announcer sophomore year. Junior year, we're in the Ostrom house. We had some changes at the leadership levels at the top of the station, and there were some vacancies at the top, and folks needed to step up. So I remember Paul Chambers stepped up as our GM. Jana became our program director. Katie Bell became our VP of business and really kind of the glue in a lot of ways. And I stepped into the VP of ops role, not having had any, technical experience on how to fix gear or anything, but somebody needed to take that job. So I took that job and really leaned on folks like John Farrakani and Rob Crandall to help the technical side of things. And it was tough because in serving as, chief announcer and then VP of ops, when an overnight jock doesn't show up and your phone rings at 2 or 4 a.m., my roommates are like, why the hell are you going to the radio station at 4 a.m.? Like, can't go off the air. Somebody needs to go on the air. Somebody needs to take that role. And then the same thing as operations manager junior year. And it took a toll on me. And I know a lot of guests on our podcast has taken a toll on as well. And at the end of junior year, I think I might have served as interim program director for 2 weeks, letting Josh handle the music and saying, okay, Josh, tell me what you're doing and I'll sign off on it. And then senior year, I just focused on being on the air and, helping out wherever I was needed once we were back in the new studios. Because I think the junior year took a lot out of me as operations manager. But it was an incredible experience. Learned a lot, including running the station, helping run the station over Christmas break, that 2000-2001 year, where we split it up 3 ways, where Paul Chambers took the first third of the break, I took the middle half, because hell, let the Jewish kid work on Christmas, and then Brett took the final third of it. We leaned on these high schoolers. We had to automate the overnight, so I found a 5-disc CD changer, burned 5 60-minute CDs, legal ID at the beginning of each one, and that was our overnight until the CD player broke, and I called my mom crying, and then we found somebody to come fix it, and there. So there was a lot of stresses that year, but I feel like it's almost like the hazing that so many of us have been through, finding our way through difficult things at the radio station.
That was also a unique year, too, because there was a fair bit of turnover at the top as far as the leadership of the station, but also you were in the house. We were in the house that year. What would you say, for anybody who wasn't familiar with that brief period of history at the station, what was the essence of the house?
Well, I could give you the quick answer that Farrakani gave and say the essence is that it was a shithole. But the essence of the house was survival. If we had to put a single word on it, it would be survival. We knew that we'd had this thing that had gone on for 20 plus years at that point. And as other folks have said in the podcast, we didn't want to let it die. We didn't want to be the ones that let this thing go under after so many years and so many decades of so many people have put the blood, sweat, and tears into it. What do we have to do to stay on the air? What do we have to do to survive this year, knowing that we're going to have new studios set up the following year?
You were part of the team broadcasting on 9/11, and you did a great episode about this day with Brett Bossy, Leah Hoffman, and Dave Peterson. Walk us through some of the things that you did that day for folks who may not have heard that whole episode by itself.
I had a really minor role that day compared to the other 3 folks that you just mentioned that we had on that podcast. I remember my late roommate Bill Leaf's mom calling the apartment and waking us up at roughly 8:30, I think, when in the thick of when all those things were happening. Are you watching TV? You see what's happening? No, what's going on? I turned the TV on and it's like, whoa. So I don't know if this was instinct or not. The first thing I did was I reached for my clock radio and I turned on Z. And I heard ABC News, and I'm like, what? I couldn't wrap my brain around exactly what was going on. And later come to find out that Peterman, as the morning show host with Leah, and also as the GM, Peterman, they decided they were going to run ABC News thanks to the folks over at 95X for letting us rebroadcast their signal. So I remember I went and I took this astronomy quiz that I bombed, not because of the 9/11, because I didn't study for it. And I remember I brought a boombox to the station because I'm like, we need to record what's happening today for posterity. And it kills me to this day. I've digitized all my shoebox full of cassettes. I can't find the audio from September 11th. It exists somewhere. Someday, somehow, you'll find it. But I know it exists somewhere. But my role, I was on the afternoon shift that day, and we ran 95X ABC News all afternoon. We'd break in at the top of the hour, we'd give the legal ID, and then just try to give resources for what's available for students, whether it was transforming that phone bank where they would call alumni and ask for money, transforming that into a phone bank of, students trying to reach their families in New York or DC or Pennsylvania, or whatever the case may be. Just trying to give resources, trying to get as much information as we could, which in the early days of the internet, when we didn't have a lot and we were running back and forth to the Kimmel computer cluster to print stuff out, we were doing the best we could. And that's actually one of my favorite episodes of the podcast because we kind of relived that day. And at 7 o'clock, I handed it off to the next jock who played just a very scaled down playlist like Rocket Ross talked about after Pan Am 103. Just trying to keep the right appropriate music on the air at that time. And That was a day I'll never forget. That was the only day in my 20 years on the air that I went by John Gay on the air. I wasn't going to go by Jag or John Gray or any other alias I've used. I'm like, this is serious. I'll actually use my actual birth name on the air.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I wanted to ask you about where the nickname Jag came from. Did it start at Z89 or did that come with you from back home?
Oh, no, it actually started at JPZ. So I remember, keep in mind, this is fall 1998. The name John Gay was not going to be really work on the air at that time. There would have been some pushback. I got pushback in high school when I ran for class treasurer under the campaign slogan, "Get the issue straight, vote gay." I got a lot of blowback from that. My brother, 4 years later, went a little bolder with "It's okay to go gay," and he got pushback from that. So I knew John Gay wasn't going to really work on the radio in 1998. So I was kind of just asking around the guys on my floor in Sadler, like, hey, Johnny G, John Gray. My initials are JAG. My middle name's Alexander. So I'm like, what about JAG? There's a TV show called JAG. And that seemed to be the consensus pick of hey, that's kind of cool. It's kind of unique. You should go with that. And the funniest thing is now, all these years later, anybody I know from Syracuse calls me Jag. Anybody that I worked with in radio in Vermont, Detroit, or New Orleans calls me Jag. But, my in-laws here, my wife, my family, any folks that I've met mostly in my podcast business, they call me John. So Ellen, my wife, jokes that she's bilingual, that when she's with different groups of people, she'll refer to me as either Jag or John. It must be weird for you to think of me as John, but I kind of go by both now.
I can't recall ever calling you John, period. From day one, you were Jag on the air and you were Jag to me. And I will call you that until the end. Before we jump to your radio career after Z89, any stories you want to mention about your time at the station, something funny or something that stuck with you that you want to share?
Well, you and I were talking about this offline. I'll be curious for your recollection of this as well. And again, I'm frustrated I couldn't find the audio. But my very last night on the air, freshman year, I was so excited. I want to go on the radio one more time. My best friend, Kenny, that I grew up with, had come to Syracuse with my parents to help move me out. And I had the 11 to 2 shift and somehow had laryngitis. And I was like, I'm not going to miss my last show. I'm going home for the summer. I'm not going to be back and be able to do this for 3-4 months. So I went on the air talking over songs like Jennifer Lopez, if You Had My Love, and the Benga Boys, We Like to Party. I'm trying to recreate it as best as I can. And I remember, because you were the program director at that point, you called, and my roommate, Chris Pappas, who also was on the air, was there as well to do the overnight after me. And you want to pick up the story from there?
Well, I was listening to your show while doing my homework, and I had to call the request line, or maybe it was the hotline, I don't know. And I was like, you got to go off the air. I'm sorry. This is not going to work. Although I can't remember, did I call once or twice? Because I feel like I may have called the first time and you were like, no, it's okay. I'll be all right. And I believed you. I said, okay, maybe, just clear your throat a little bit next time and try to get through this. So I believe there were 2 phone calls. You got through another break or 2, and then I was like, yo, this has got to stop.
He's making the hand across his throat motion right now. I had forgotten that there were 2 calls, but now that you mention it. So I remember answering the phone the second time. You're like, Jag, it's Matt. And I'm basically like, yeah, I know. Hey, is Pappas there with you? Yeah, you want me to have him take over? Yeah, I'm going to need you to do that.
Please.
Okay.
Before we talk about your first full-time radio gig, we should briefly mention, I guess, your stops at KISS 108 as an intern and your part-time job at WPRO, both huge stations. What did you do there?
Summer of 2001, that was the summer before senior year, I interned at KISS 108 in Boston, working afternoons for the legendary Dale Dorman, and then Sunday afternoons for another big name in radio, Skip Kelly. I remember having to pay $600 to do it because I needed to have it for course credit, and it counted as a summer credit for Syracuse. I had to have an internship to graduate at Newhouse. I went in there, and Dale Dorman, who's probably 60-something at the time, said, answer the request line. You got it. I'll be the best damn request line answerer you ever had. What else can I do? Answer the request line. Okay, what else? Answer the request line. Oh, okay. And then, well, I want to do more. What else can I do? And he pulls out his car keys. He said, can you go wash my Jeep for me? And I froze because I wasn't sure. He was a really sarcastic guy. I wasn't sure if he was being serious or he was just kind of pulling my chain. And because I didn't say yes, I guess I was never in the inner circle. And then all I did was answer the request line. I think Skip one time let me yell something at the end of a 10-second commercial read he had to do. And I learned by observing a little bit, But it was really a bad experience. You know, people have wonderful internship experiences. I had a terrible internship experience. And I made a promise to myself at that point that if I ever got into radio professionally and I had interns, I would make them feel useful. I would make them feel welcome, because I would not want anybody to go through what I went through of like, what the hell am I doing here? So Kiss 108, the station I grew up idolizing in Boston, terrible internship. But in some ways I learned a lot.
It reminds me a little bit of an internship I did at a cluster of stations in Syracuse. I was interning in the sales department, and my very first day, I show up in a shirt and tie, ready to do some serious business, learn some serious radio. And before the end of my first day, they had me cleaning out an office cubicle and literally taking trash out on a dolly through the building out to the far end of the parking lot and just dumping stuff out in my shirt and tie. So it seems like that was par for the course then. You and I are a long ways removed from internships now. Hopefully things are a little different now, but you're the old grizzled veterans talking about paying your dues. That's the kind of thing that you might go through.
So you asked me about Providence, Rhode Island as well. So That is a great JPZ story, and that I wanted to get into radio so bad. It was about a year after we'd graduated, so it was 2003. I was working at a roadside assistance call center, and I remember talking to Jeff Wade at a banquet, and he was the assistant program director of WPRO AM in Providence. And he's like, I need a board op. And I was like, well, okay, well, it's 80 miles each way. I could do that on Saturdays. So every Saturday I drove 150 miles round trip, basically, to board op everything from Providence College basketball to Red Sox baseball to Mort White's Magic Garden to some syndicated shows. And I was board opping, and I was getting paid to work in radio, and it was really cool. But as fate would have it, right around the time I decided I'm going to have to walk away from this, Josh Wolf enters the picture, our classmate a year behind us in 2003. Josh was working at his first post-graduation gig in Binghamton, New York for Clear Channel. His operations manager, Bobby D., knew the operations manager, Steve Cormier, up in Burlington, Vermont at Clear Channel. And they were looking for a midday person on their top 40 KISS station in Burlington. So I give my tape to Josh, passes it on. I get a call from who would become my very first program director, Dave Ryerson. I later found out I was his second choice for the job, because the first person they offered it to, when she heard what the pay was, she laughed. So they called me. And I went from making $30,000 a year and living at home to making $19,000 a year and living on my own. And fun fact about Burlington, Vermont, it ain't as cheap as you would think it is to live there. So I did middays there in Burlington for a couple of years. I was moved from middays to mornings until, for the first of several times in my career, December 2006, Christmas time, and also Clear Channel budget cut time. I ended up getting laid off for budget cuts. I'm not sure what I was going to do next. We had a weekend nightclub gig up in St. Albans, Vermont, which is the only city of any size between Burlington and the Canadian border. And the owner of the club said, hey, I want you to be my marketing guy. Okay, well, sure. So the first call I made after I walked out of the building was to the club owner. Called him up. We ended up having a lovely venison dinner, and he convinced me to become the marketing guy. And then 2 months later, they lost their liquor license. So it's a string of bad luck. Simultaneously, I knew that the crosstown radio station, 95 XXX, the longtime heritage station in Burlington, Vermont, legendary, intimidating program director Ben Hamilton, who I'd heard all these horror stories about, said, well, what have I got to lose? I don't have a non-compete. I'll call him up. So I called him up, went in, met with him. He was, at the time, a decent human being in our first meeting, and he brought me in to do weekends. So I was doing weekends, and then when the nightclub got shut down, their sister station was an AM station. They needed somebody to fill in as the co-host of their and do the news on their morning talk show on AM station, which I'd never done news, but I'm like, hey, it's a job for 6 weeks. I'll take it. Ended up doing that for 6 weeks, had an amazing time, despite the fact the co-host was my dad's age and I was his kid's age. Charlie Papillo, one of the highlights of my career was doing news talk mornings with him because we just had such great chemistry. And then as that was winding down, the night guy down the hall on 95 XXX decided he wanted to move back down to Boston. And so nights opened up. I was kind of there waiting in the wings. I got it on a provisional basis and then sort of got it full time and was there doing nights for a little over 4 years, 2007 to 2011. And those are some years that I won't soon forget.
So here you are doing nights on North America's last untamed radio station, correct?
That was what the top of the hour said. It was, you are listening to the last untamed radio station in North America. It was, for those who don't know the station, the call letters are WXXX. It was a top 40 station in a rock station's body. We were encouraged to push the envelope as much as possible. I've listened to tapes from 2008, 2009 going, well, that joke hasn't aged well.
And then you took that act to a major market. You're jumping from market 130 something after 7 years or so?
7 total, 4 at 95 XXX, yeah.
And then you get a call in a market just outside the top 10.
And again, this is Josh Wolf. I joke with Josh that he should be getting 10% of my salary because he was the closest thing I had to an agent all these years. Mm-hmm. And this is just another networking story for any students that are listening. And again, Josh Wolf was a year behind us. This wasn't like an alum a couple of years older that I was trying to impress. He was just a contemporary of ours. So a year prior to me getting the gig, Josh interviewed for a gig at Channel 955 WKQI in Detroit. He interviewed to be their imaging person. He interviewed with the program director, Michael McCoy, great guy. It didn't end up working out. They went with another candidate. But after he did the interview, Josh, who had stayed, does so great at staying in touch with people, as anybody listening to this podcast knows, Josh said, hey, this Michael McCoy guy in Detroit, he's a really smart guy. You should send him a tape and see if he'll air check your tape for you. So, okay, sure. Hey, Mr. McCoy, Josh Wolf said I should reach out to you, blah, blah, blah. So I sent him the tape, and McCoy sent me some pretty good feedback on the tape. He said make the demo 2 minutes, not 3, and then critique the breaks and went from there. So about a year later, Josh hits me up and says, hey, McCoy's looking for a night guy in Detroit. And I'm like, okay. And we'd had people leave that radio station and go to some major market gigs. I didn't know if I was ready for that, but I took the shot at it. And I reached out, I forwarded the previous email from a year ago in case you didn't remember me. Mr. McCoy, thank you for your feedback. I've tried to take your feedback and apply it. Here's my updated demo. I know you're looking for nights. I'd be really interested. So went there for the interview. Took the job, best thing that ever happened to me. I got to really reconnect with Matt Friedman, who is about as great a Detroit ambassador as we have in our group. Mm-hmm. Became very close and very good friends with Matt. Did nights there for 9 months. It was probably my favorite 9 months of my career because it was a show. And in the Motor City, they love their radio stations. It's such a great radio market. And I was encouraged, again, to push the envelope, maybe not quite as far as I did in Vermont because I'm working for a large company now. But I remember doing what's it like to get shot as a call-in topic. I remember doing what's worse, catching your parents having sex or them catching you as a call-in topic. I have those tapes somewhere. And there I met one of my very, very close friends, Joe Rosati, who was doing middays at the time. And 9 months into the gig, they have cuts. Joe gets let go. They need me as a body to do some production during the day. So I hate that corporate made this decision, but they voice tracked nights and moved me over to middays and some production help. And then sure enough, 9 months later, the old zig came for me, another Clear Channel layoff. And so looking for a gig, JPZ comes into the picture again. Matt Friedman introduces me to a radio consultant he knows, Gary Berkowitz. Gary Berkowitz knows a program director in New Orleans, Don Goslin, who's looking for a program director for his hot AC station. End up getting that gig. Spent 3 years in New Orleans as program director of my favorite name of a radio station I ever worked for, Voodoo 104.
Mm-hmm. This is your first programming gig.
Yeah.
What are you doing in this position? What are you learning in this position?
A lot, and probably a lot more in hindsight than I realized at the time. I did not have experience with selector programming music, which I kick myself to this day that I did not learn at JPZ. I don't care what you're doing. If you're anywhere near music or on the air at JPZ, learn how to do selector and today G selector. That was something that would come back to bite me a few times in my career, not having that skill set. So I didn't know selector, and so they said, that's okay. We're going to be a hot AC station, and corporate's going to program the music. You're just going to download the playlist every day. And I'm like, all right, well, I can live with that. That's fine. I don't have that skill set at this point in my career. I want to learn it, but I don't have it right now. And then I also realized that I was the only really full-time employee of the radio station. We had a voice tracker out of Virginia Beach doing mornings. We had a voice tracker out of Indianapolis doing middays. And we had a local part-timer from our urban station voice tracking nights. And I was program director, afternoons, imaging, trying to help put promotions together with our rockstar promotions director. And I learned a lot about prioritizing. I learned about, what's important, kind of re-imaged the radio station, took it over. We did some cool promotions. I learned a lot about New Orleans, and I learned that it is its own country, really, in terms of how things operate and run down there. It is unlike any other place in this great nation of ours, and I had to really, I think, check my ego at the door. First of all, they would call me a Yankee, which offends me as a Red Sox fan. Huh. You are a Northerner, you do not know how we do things here, and okay, please explain it to me. If I wrote imaging that was supposed to be local, I had 4 people in the office I would run it through before I went and had it voiced, because Whether it's how to pronounce Tchoupitoulas or, the phrase, I want to be in that number. I corrected something once because that's not grammatically correct, but that's when the Saints go marching in. I want to be in that number. I had to realize that and all the culture of New Orleans. I did not eat or drink as well in my life as I ever did during those 3 years there. And unfortunately, I have age 30 to 33 when your metabolism slows down. So I kind of ballooned out a little bit when I was there. Those who knew me in college knew I was a twig, but finally put a few pounds on in New Orleans.
Who among us?
Yeah. And so it was a great gig. And then we had, again, story of this podcast so far, more budget cuts and more changes. And we had a different crew and a different management. I had some difficult conversations and moments with folks down there. I had to learn that when you're in a management role, you're held to a higher standard. I grew up a lot in that gig, and it's one of those I wish I had known then what I know now in terms of dealing with people in difficult situations. But the two things that really caused that gig to end were, on one hand, I was losing the small amount of autonomy I had. And I learned that in that company, you either are somebody who embraces company initiatives and get promoted, or you're somebody who bucks the system and doesn't. Long story short, I'm losing all these day parts. I'm losing the flavor of the radio station. And then when it came to the rock, I got the rock station. Said, hey, I want to voice track 10 to 3. I've never done rock. Let me voice track Saturdays 10 to 3 once a week and do some rock and get my chops there. No. We need the national syndicated jock on. You want a national jock as opposed to somebody who's local here in the market. Yeah, we need to clear that national jock in another market. Okay, I kind of see where this is trending and where this is going. And so at the same time, my friend Ellen, that I was friendly with and only friends with in Detroit before I left to go to New Orleans, as the saying goes, absence makes the heart grow fonder, and nobody knows this better than you, Matt, in many hours-long conversations we had on the telephone about this when I was in New Orleans. But
you must be referring to St. Ellen.
Yes. Matt came up with St. Ellen because she put up with me not knowing what I wanted to do and going back and forth. But long, painful story short, we went from friends to a little more than friends to official long-distance relationship to, hey, I'm going to quit my job in New Orleans and move in with you in Detroit without a job, and we're going to give this thing a shot because we're not getting any younger. I left the job in New Orleans of January of 16. 9 months later, Ellen and I were engaged. 9 months later, you were standing up in our wedding.
It's true. Who could have foreseen? Well,
you.
I did. Ellen did. We knew.
As with the case with music on Z89 in 1999, I should have listened to you.
When you know, you know.
Exactly.
A huge moment in your life. I was so thrilled to be there to stand next to you in that moment. And then another huge moment in your life comes along not long after. What was that?
My last radio layoff. So a few months after I moved back to Detroit, I got a gig at the competition of my old station, 98.7 AMP Radio, which was owned by CBS at the time. Did middays there for a little over a year. They sat me down the week of my wedding and said, hey, ratings aren't where they need to be. We might need to make a change here somewhere. And then I come back from my mini-moon probably that Wednesday after my wedding, Friday afternoon. Hey, Jag, can you voice track the last half hour of your show? Okay, I've seen this movie before. Hey, you're a great guy. I like having you around the office, but the numbers aren't there, which always kind of stuck in my craw a little bit because it was right when Entercom was buying CBS. They were making cuts, and they replaced me with a part-time voice tracker. It's like, just tell me you're eliminating the position. Don't tell me it's my fault because of ratings. And then Ellen, God bless her, she's now married to a guy who doesn't have a job or really a career at that point. She said, I know you love radio, but there's always somebody waiting in line behind you to do the same job for 10 grand less and more bullshit. And I went, whoa, you're exactly right. And it took me a year or so to figure out what I was going to do.
But once you figured it out, it was at that point you made the pivot to podcasting, which was still an emerging medium at the time, I think it's fair to say. Let's talk a little bit about the leap of faith that was, not just because podcasting was relatively new, but also because you were going to start a business of your own. And I think a lot of people aspire to have that level of freedom and control over their career, but making it happen takes some bravery. Can you describe what it's like, putting yourself out there, standing on your own and being responsible for every aspect of your work? You are the brand. It's your name on the company. It's Jag in Detroit Podcast.
True, yeah. I really, in all honesty, and I'm not just blowing smoke here, all credit to Ellen, because I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I was applying to marketing jobs. I've been on the air. I've done social media. I can do one of these jobs. Oh no, we want a 22-year out of school that speaks better social media than you do. I don't know what I'm going to do. We were in Hawaii for Ellen's 40th, and she said, you're kind of half-assing this podcasting thing. You're kind of half-assing this marketing stuff. I need you to pick one of the two things and whole ass it. And I said, okay, that's fair. And Seth Ressler, who got me into podcasting, He said, you can charge people to create podcasts for them. And again, to your point, Matt, this is 2018. It's not in its infancy. It's been around a decade and a half at that point, but it's nowhere near as popular as it is now. What do you mean I can charge people this? No, trust me, you can charge people to do this. So Ellen said, I will help you with the books. I have an MBA, I have a financial background, I can help you with the books. Said, okay, so you do the work, I'll help you with the books, because that's why I never thought I could own my own business. I don't know first thing about running a business. So she set up spreadsheets for me and helps me track money in, money out, all that kind of stuff. She's my sounding board, so she's my CFO, I'm the CEO, and I built a few clients through another radio connection, Nick Craig, who I worked with at Channel 955, and it kind of snowballed from there, and I realized that my skills, both editing audio for technical and for content, and the ability to conduct an interview could be a valuable skill set, and that's kind of my unique selling proposition as opposed to a lot of people who just edit podcasts is I'll interview you about your business. I'll help you create a branded podcast about your business, and the technology is good enough now, as you probably heard on this podcast, that with a $60 USB microphone, you can sound just like you in a recording studio.
Yeah, can you give us a peek behind the curtain a little bit to explain how the magic of podcasting happens? Because for this series, you've recorded, I think, every interview from your home studio, and your interview subjects talk to you from wherever they are. And it sounds great. How does it work?
If you want to geek out for a second, I'm always happy to do that. And some of our guests have had professional microphone setups, which have sounded great. And I don't have to do much with that audio, which is always makes my life easier. But honestly, and I think when we recorded yours, Matt, you were like most using the built-in laptop microphone. Granted, if you're going to work with me as a client, we're going to get you a $60 or $70 USB microphone that's going to sound professional. By the way, don't ever buy a Blue Yeti. There's a hill for me to die on, don't ever buy a Blue Yeti microphone. Best marketed, worst podcast microphone out there. Don't ever buy a Blue Yeti. Now that I got that out of the way. The technology's come a long way in terms of just from when I started 5 years ago. There's AI software that I can run the audio through off a built-in laptop mic that will make you sound like you were done in a professional studio. There is EQ and tricks, and I've got software that does things like, let me take my pop filter away, deplosive and mouth declick and things like that that can really make the audio pristine. And if you spend the time on it, there are so many things you can do to make a podcast sound that you're recorded at home in our office sound like it's done in a professional studio, and you don't have to spend the money to rent out the studio space.
You have an incredible talent for honoring and preserving legacy.
Thank you.
You have a great memory. You're able to remember little details about my own life sometimes, and I have memory holes, and I'm only able to excavate at your prompting. And your talent took on a greater meaning and purpose in 2006 when our friend and summertime JPZ'er, Bill Leaf, was killed by a drunk driver in a head-on crash. Mm-hmm. Bill was your roommate, your best friend at SU, and you made it your mission to make sure that he was never forgotten. You've written at length about his life and even spoke publicly at schools and many other places about the dangers of driving under the influence and the real cost that comes with that. Can you kind of walk us through your honoring of Bill's life and just kind of speaking up for this cause?
I wasn't sure if you were going to go here, but I'm happy to engage you on this if I don't get too choked up. It was a moment in my life that I won't forget. I know you won't forget in January of 2006 when Bill was killed. And Bill and I were, as you know, thick as thieves. We were incredibly, incredibly close. Think about your closest friend at Syracuse and imagine at 25, they're gone in an instant. And it was the worst day of my life. And I remember at some point thinking, if the situation were reversed, and you knew Bill very well as well, I feel like if the situation were reversed, Bill would honor me. I felt like Bill would not want anybody to forget about JAG. And so that's kind of one piece of it. And the other piece of it was, if me telling the story stops one person from getting behind the wheel and driving, then it's worth me telling the story. What's interesting is, yes, I posted the story on social media every year, usually on his birthday in October and in January and the anniversary of his passing. I have friends that met me after Syracuse that I worked with in various markets. I feel like I knew Bill because I read your story when you post it every year, and you couldn't pay me a higher compliment. And I'm so happy to honor my friend in that way. It was important for me to do that, and I remember when I was doing nights on Channel here in Detroit, so a lot of the teenage, high school crowd knew who I was. It's on some level, and I remember that's when I started going to some high schools around Palm time, and I told the story. And I think it was the first or second time I did it, I had a young lady come up to me and ask me, "Can I ask you a personal question?" And yeah, sure. Do you forgive the man that killed your friend? And this is, I don't know, this is probably 2011, so it's probably 5 or 6 years afterwards, and Matthew Benedict at that time, the one who killed Bill, was still in jail. And I thought about it for a second, and I said, no, I don't. He was a repeat offender. He was driving on a suspended license. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I've never driven drunk. There were a couple times in my life, and I regret it, but there were a couple times when I was 22, when I was invincible, and I thought, I'll make it home, no problem. I'm not proud of that. Especially in hindsight, I'm ashamed of that. I'm not going to pretend I've never done it. But the fact that he was a repeat offender, didn't seem to have a care in the world at that time. And I said, no, I don't forgive him. And now we're in a world with Uber and Lyft in so many places, and that's proliferated everywhere. There's no reason for you to get behind the wheel. If you're unsure, if you're buzzed, I did it, Bill did it. Almost everybody I know has done it at some point in their early 20s. But please, don't ever do that, because I would never want someone to experience that day and that week and that month like I did, because that was certainly a pivotal moment in my life.
You've honored Bill's memory with such detail and dignity, and now you're doing the same for the WJPZ story. As we wrap up here, any final thoughts about the podcast and what this has meant to you and what you hope it means for the station and for its alumni?
This has been professionally the most rewarding thing I've ever been a part of. I can unequivocally say that. It started out as an idea of, hey, let me do 50 of these to commemorate 50 years. And I was kind of nervous because we have so many tremendously successful people in our group that I thought there'd be a lot of feedback of, hey, do this differently. I didn't like the way you did this. Maybe you should try this tactic instead. But it's been kind of the opposite, where so many people have said, oh, you need to get this person. Let me connect you with this person. Go get this person. Let me connect to this person. So I was planning on doing 50, but much like ESPN's 30 for 30, that's however many 100 documentaries now, this thing is going way beyond 50. As of this recording, we're recording this, full disclosure, on February 9th. I'm close to 70 interviews.
Wow.
The only thing that I have to say, and by the time this airs, this announcement will have previously aired in the podcast, but I have to pull back the cadence because releasing 3 of these every week has been a lot of a time commitment. Mm-hmm. And so after Banquet and after releasing every day of the week of Banquet, I'm going to pull back to once a week so I can kind of get caught up and focus on growing my business. And I want to read you something, actually, because I thought you might ask me about this. One of the highest compliments that I got was from our classmate and mutual friend, Jana Fiorello. This group text of the 5 of us, you, me, Jana, Beth, and Brett from O2, has kind of reignited in the last several months. And Jana and I were having a side conversation, and she wrote, I think what you're doing with these podcasts is so truly special, and I love how they've been making our group chats more active. I'm so excited to see you in March, and I'm really looking forward to my own little podcast chat with you. But I've been hearing these conversations of folks throughout the decades of, Matt Friedman tells me that the class of 94 and 95, hey, did you hear today's episode? And it's prompting these conversations amongst all these different eras. I've heard from folks from the 80s as well, and the 2000s and 2010s. It's really been a way to reconnect leading into Banquet. And part of the reason I wanted this was, of course, to promote people to come to Banquet, which is a big deal. But I have learned so much about the station. I've met so many people. I've learned so many stories. I've been able to make so many connections. James Bames Grundy, who got his master's in 2020, has helped me with some of the editing. He's helped take some of the load off of me, which has been fantastic. 2 people I want to mention very quickly, not in the credits of the podcast. Matt Friedman has connected me with so many of the first half of the 50 years, and Josh Wolf has connected me with so many of the latter half of the 50 years. Where we sit in O2, we're kind of in the middle, Matt, of the 50 years. But getting names and getting connected to all these people I've been able to get, I'm really happy to say that we've got a lot of diverse perspectives in terms of both demographics, but also age. That we have, 1 minute, we've got Greg Hernandez and Bill Bliley from 76, and the next minute we've got Kyle Leff from 22. And the thing that Scott McFarland said to me in the very first episode that I recorded, he said, everybody's the same person. It doesn't matter if, or he said that in a documentary, I think, too, that, it doesn't matter what year you graduated, 72 or 22. We're all kind of that same person. We all have that same je ne sais quoi, I guess, about us. You're just my friend from school. It doesn't matter what year you graduated. We wouldn't have to go to school together, 10 years, 20 years apart. You're just my friend from school. This organization is so amazing. People who aren't part of it may not understand how amazing a group this is and how unique it is. And I feel like we've really been able to dive into that in the podcast. It's just been so rewarding.
Jag, thank you for your time. Thank you for your friendship. A quarter century this year, I don't want to point out.
Oh, you had to go there. Okay.
And thank you for the gift of this podcast series.
Thank you for the kind words, Matt. I always appreciate spending time with you.
The WJPZ at 50 podcast is created entirely by the staff and alumni of the world's greatest media classroom.
It's hosted by John Jag Gay, class of 2002. Editing help from James Bames Grundy III, class of 2020.
Imaging by Maureen Cooper, class of 1999.
And Ed Lacombe, class of 1985.
Podcast artwork by Marty Dundix, class of 2001.
Follow WJPZ at 50 on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube,
or wherever you're listening right now.